clocks. A lot of people that are on the crew. Today, for our speaker for this time period, we have a well-known clock collector and woodworker named Joel from Ithaca, New York. Joel has been making parts for Ithaca calendar clocks, mostly the wooden cases, for longer than I can probably tell you. Goes back 30 or 40 years. He's an expert. You're going to learn a lot. So this is Joel up here in front. Give him a round of applause. And thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Lee. Well, what I'm going to talk about today is kind of an overview instead of getting right down into the furrows of how lots of things are done. So to give you an idea as to how you make these things, the different aspects, the different regiments you need to learn, and just give a broad brush to each of them so that you can actually see how it's done. So my first thing, I decided, I don't know why, but in 1978, I restarted the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company. And in doing that, I had to reverse engineer an entire manufacturing facility from the 1800s. So what I did was at first I scratched my head and I said, who might be around Ithaca still that was there? And there was one person, research. First person eyewitness to actual production. There was actually one person that I knew that was there. And then documentation from vintage publications and photographs and artifacts like tools, machinery, personal possessions of guys from the period. So fortunately, I started it at a time when some of those were still around. And this is the list of I had 4 people. The first one is a guy named Cecil Redinas. He was a cabinet maker in Ithaca. He made grandfather clock, he made gun cases, furniture stuff, tables, chairs, and that sort of thing. But when he was around 1905, I think he was in his early 20s, he went down to the clock factory because he thought that would be a great source of employment. So they took him through the plant, and he walked around, and he came out and he said, this is way too intense for me, I gotta go do something else. But he went through the plant, and he's told me several things about what they were doing. The second person I knew was Harry Dean, who worked at the clock factory from 1904 to 1914. He was in the movement room. He was responsible for putting the movements in the cases and doing their repair work, because people sent the clocks back to the factory to have them overhauled after 10, 15, 20 years of running. So he was in charge of that aspect as well. And then a fellow named Kenny Allen, Red Allen, he was about this tall. And he ran the mill at the Robinson Carpenter Lumber Company, which started in the 1890s. And Ken and his dad were at the clock factory for the liquidation auction. And he gave me a list of the machinery, who bought them, and how much they bought it for. So that was a good resource. So at least I'm starting to piece things together as to what I would need to acquire if I'm going to do something like this. And the last fellow is Ray Carpenter. He lived around the corner from me in Jacksonville, New York. He and his dad sold chestnut, pine, and basswood to the factory for their boxes for shipping the clocks out. So they would go down there periodically with a wagon load of wood, sell it to them, and then come back. But in doing so, they was all over the first floor, because the first floor on the east side is where they had all the rough lumber, planing, resawing, kiln drying lumber. And so he was around all of that. So Cecil like I said, he summarized the grandfather clock production like ants on honey. He said they're pushing carts here, guys are running over here, stacks of cases like this. He said, and he shuffles the change in his pockets, and he goes, I don't know, that was too much for me. But he told me all about how they had things set up. So then when you get started, any and all woodworking production experience, this is the kind of thing that had to go through my head to start off this company. And at that point in time, the Ithaca Gun Company was booming. They had a complete wood shop, and I knew 3 or 4 of the guys that worked in the wood shop there. So they gave me a good idea as to what shapers were for and what milling machines were for, so on and so forth. So I garnered that information. And then publications, I have original printings of the Ithaca Journal articles about the Ithaca Clock Factory. And this is one of them. This was written on September 20th, 1875. And it goes through, it lists everything, every facet of the clock factory from a novice's perspective. It says, for example, the stairway leads to the second floor where we find ourselves in a case-making department. A considerable portion of this very particular and handsome work is done by hand, but much is done by machinery. Among the machines to be found here is a shaving machine, a tenning machine, a matching machine, a molding machine, turning lathes, 2 planers, etc. So there's my inventory. Now all I have to do is find it. And photos. Photos was next. Fortunately, the DeWitt Historical Society had a really nice collection of glass plate negatives from the 1860s and 1870s in their collection. And they printed them off for me. And so this is a picture of the Ithaca Clock Factory. This picture is about 1868. Now, there are 2 separate pictures of this, and one of them, the other picture, which I don't have a copy of here, has a guy standing out on the stairs over there, and then the windows open up here. There. And me being the wonk that I am, what I did was I took the picture and I blew it up because I thought, there's an open window. And so there it is with the movements on the bench getting ready to be put in the clock cases. And there's 2 people. There's one right there, you can see his collar, and then there's another guy with his shirt right there. And they've got their wire cutters and screwdrivers on their workbench. I thought that was pretty cool. Didn't do much for learning, but it was, it's wonky. There you go. So then when they moved into their new facility in 1875, they took more pictures. And again, I'm looking in the windows and I'm thinking, what's this guy doing up here? What's this guy do down here? What's this line across here? Because this and this were the case-making departments. Now in 1876, they had a fire. And the building now as it stands, this whole section is gone. But these 2 are still there. They still remain. So of course I'm blowing the pictures up, trying to see what I can find. And I think that this is the guy that made the parlor ornament pieces. Because in the article, it says in one corner, this is the box making portion of the building. And there's a guy in a corner making the ornaments for the parlor clocks. And I think that's the guy. But it doesn't do me a lot of good. But still, it's cool. So Cecil sees that I'm starting up the clock company again. And he says to me, he comes into the shop and he sees how I'm setting things up, just coming up with my fixtures and trying to get my head around how they actually did this stuff. And he walks up to me and he goes, as near as I can tell, there's the right way, the wrong way, and the Warren way. And he said to me, he said, oh, by the way, did you save your first dollar? And I looked at him and I went, no. So he gets his big grin on his face, he pulls his wallet out, and in the side sleeve of the wallet, he pulls out $1, and that's it. So that was Cecil. He was a different person. And there I am, newspaper article when we decided to start the factory over again. You can see I've got my prototype stuff here and there, trying to work out the designs. This is the brochure that we made up. We made this brochure about 1.5 years after the newspaper article was in place. Because by that time, I had ironed out all the kinks in production and gotten everything up to speed so that we could run. We did runs of each of these models. We would double them up. For example, the hanger, library, and the shelf were the same clock, but we just, because of the base moldings were different, that was it. So when we would make production of them, we would make them 45 at a time. And we would make them from there up, all the same, and then we would run specific numbers of the bottoms, and we would write inside the case, shelf clock, hanger, shelf clock, hanger, hanger, hanger. The office clock, we made a bunch of, and I'll explain some of that later. And we also did the Belgrade was the same way. From the door down, it was either a shelf or a hanger held together with the same 3 screws so that you could interchange them based on what somebody would want. So our first production was this number 6 hanging library, called the carved top library, we called it. This is a picture that we used. We were going to make individual brochures. If somebody asked for information on one specific model, we were going to send that to them. But we took the pictures, but it never got off the ground. But this is good to show you what it looks like as it's coming off our line. So the first thing I learned is you got to work up worksheets for everybody because nobody else knows what this is. I'm hiring people kind of off the street or just out of high school. So you have to make it so that what they do is just off the charts good. So you try to account for all the foolishness, all the idiocy that could come into play when you get a bunch of guys running around machines with blades whirling around all the time. You want to do that for protection, and you want to do that to minimize your source, your materials, and to maximize your production and your profits. So I made worksheets for this library clock, and this is a cross-section of them. I just put this on here to give you an idea. So they would have them on their clipboard, and they'd each get their cut list in the morning, and they would run around and get the wood and do this and do that with it, meet it up at the end of the day, and then we would take the next step the next day. So, for example, it says here, this is the top return. This goes behind the top carvings. We needed 480 inches or 12 12-footers for 60 clocks. So, okay, Eric, you're making 12 12-footers today. That kind of thing. So then when we got into the construction of it, I had to break the case back into its elements so that, like I said, anybody could do this thing. So this is the case front this is how they made them back at the old clock factory in the 1870s. It's the same construction, literally. So this is the front, and in the back, I've got my notches cut out and then glued on for the pendulum opening. And since the pendulum opening is from the front of the clock with a little door, you turn the knob and the door comes out, and it's got a diamond-shaped brass piece that hits the inside there to hold the door on, but you don't want to, but you have to have it to clear the pendulum, so the clock will work. And after 2 runs, I had another amazing thought, and that was to extend the case upwards and put 2 screws in it, because prior we were just sitting the top in it, in the channel, just drop the top in it, or when we would ship it, we just take it off and wrap it up and set it on top of the clock and double box it, and away it would go. So I figured, you're going to lose it, you're going to break it, something's going to happen to it. So I came up with this suggestion, and we started using that as a regular. So we put 2 screws in it to hold the top which made sense. And then that's clock number 207, gives you an idea where we were going with this. So then you have two holes you have to put in this thing. And you would think that you would cut them out on a jigsaw, or somebody would put a template over it, draw two circles and cut them out. Well, you don't do that. You rough draw the circles out, and I have here. I made up a template with the two circles so the movement centers are correct for the seat boards and the center to center for the production. So Joe would sit at the shaper and just run this around, run this one around, pull it out, put the next one in, and run it around and run it around. So everything was nice and clean, perfect circles. Positioning, well, see, that's what I was getting at, is that you would think that they would cut them out on a jigsaw or scroll saw or something to that effect, but you actually run it on the shaper. And so this is the setup for cutting those circles. This bearing down here is a ball bearing collar that you rub. It's like a rubbing collar. You know, are you familiar with like router bits? They have the little cone pin on the top that you use as a guide to run the wood around. Well, this is the same principle, only I put it on the bottom for this one, so that the template would be sitting on the bed of the shaper, and you just make a motion, pick it up, and make another motion, and then slip it out and put the next one in. So it didn't take nearly as much time as you thought it did, because you would cut the circles for anywhere from 1/8 to 1/4, or even 3/8 inside the line that you drew for the template, because the shaper will just chew that off in a heartbeat. That's what it gets to. So this is in my shop, back making these library clocks. This is Eric over here, who's running base molding for the hanger models. And there's Joe over there, and he's actually cutting the circles out on that template. So they make clean, perfect circles and centers of the movements to seat boards, and center to center between movements are all accounted for. You don't have to think about it. You don't have to worry about it. You can forget about it. So it gives you an idea where we were going with our production. There's 22 of them on this table. And Joe's putting in the little glue blocks around the bonnet. So this is case number 20 from our first run, and I pulled it off because it had a couple little imperfections in the veneer, and I figured at some point we'll pull it up, scrape them off, and redo them. But you know how it goes. Some days you do, some days you don't. So I'm kind of glad that I held it off and didn't do anything with it. This is another picture of our production. You can see all the bonnets over here. The most important thing that I figured out was that the transferable pattern, like the carved top, you saw the leaves on the sides, and the way the elements work to them from the artistic point of view, the top carving. So I looked at that and I looked at that and I thought, well, how did these guys do it? I mean, they're running thousands of these. They don't have somebody sitting there with a piece of paper or a piece of wood drawn with a pencil around it to have somebody cut it out on a jigsaw or a bandsaw. They didn't do that. So, a little confession time. Before this all happened, and for a while this production was going on, I used to be a professional musician. And I played with Chuck Berry for a long time. And when we would go to New York, we stayed at this place called the President Hotel. And it was borderline. It was kitty corner between the ABC television studios, the President Hotel, and then Mama Leone's restaurant on 48th and Broadway. Every floor, the walls were white, but they had this vine printing on it. And every floor of the vine was a different color, but it was still the same pattern. And I'm walking down the hall and I'm looking at it going, this one's orange. The one down there is green. But it's the same. How do they do that? Then I thought to myself, I said, they have a rubber roller. And they just dip it into paint and run it up and down the wall. So I put that together with the need for carvings. So the solution, the Warren way. I made a giant rubber stamp that stamped out 2 tops at the same time. They were opposite each other. You can still see the ink here. See that? The black stuff there, that's the ink. There's a little bit of it there, some of it around here, here. So what I did was I drew this out, and I put in all the lines that I was going to need. I have my border line for the channel carvings, and then I have another line for the veining carving. So, how can you see it this way? So what I did was I made, so they were 2 at once, so you could make them multiple lengths. You could run a board they were all 9 1/4 wide, 1/2 inch thick, but you could have it 3 feet, 5 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet if you want. And they would I flipped them. So like this and like this. So you would have an angle like that with 2 of them. So we just ink up the roller, boom, ink up the roller, boom, ink up the roller, boom. So I had 2 guys cutting those tops out of on scroll saws while I was carving them. See that one up here, I did that one, I don't know, maybe a month and a half ago, something like that. But you can see where I came up with the whole thing, and I still have that pattern. What can I say? There I am, I got all my soldiers over here as they're coming off the line. This one is, I think that's clock 245. Came in for repairs about maybe 6 years ago, and I said, geez, I don't see these out anywhere. So I better take a picture while I can. So that's what I did for this one. Now, where did it go? No, I got to go back, I'm sorry. Oh, here we go. Now, the top carving, production-wise, you're not gonna believe this, but this is actual fact. Day 1 of this production, I carved 19 of them. And day 2, I carved 21 of them. With those 2 guys, as fast as they could cut them out on the scroll saws, I'm banging away and get them done. So that's how we were able to do this, make this actually a viable project. So current projects, what I'm doing is kind of giving an overview of how these things are done. So I have to jump from model to model. And some of it was from the old clock shop days, the calendar clock days. And then some of it has been what I have done afterwards. So I still make this old regulator. I don't make a lot of them, and I haven't made one in a while. And I'm not going to make any for a while coming up because I've got a real rotator cuff problem going on. So rule number 1, make a 100% accurate drawing in full size. That way you know if it's going to work, if it's not going to work, if it's in proportion or if it's not in proportion, how it's going to fit together, how you can second guess your joinery, what the whole presentation is going to look like. And it's a lot easier moving an eraser than throwing the wood out. Breaking down the elements into simple, understandable categories. Every one of these clocks falls into that statement because they're broken into positions for production purposes. How often you can repeat the process is how much more successful you're going to be at that business. So they break things down so into their similarities. So one guy might be making parts for 3 different model clocks, but it's all the same procedure. Just a different cut list, 3 or 4 inches this way or a foot that way. So that's how you do that. You do not leave anything to your imagination or memory, because believe me, I've been down that road and it is not pretty. And if at all possible, generate templates to match the examples. So here's my drawer for my making the zero regulators. So these are all templates that I need to make one of those clocks, so I don't have to think about it anymore. I don't have to, there's no variation. Everything is going to match. I know how it's going to fit in this spot. I know what I have to do to get it there, so on and so forth. It's a production, even though it's just one, me. Patience. Take your time and make sure you have every single measurement, no matter how seemingly insignificant or obvious. Like, oh yeah, that's 3 inches, I'll remember that. Yeah, right. A tracing and a number. You know, people say, well, sure, you can trace it out and then you can make it. Well, that's true to a point, because a tracing and a number are two completely different things. While equally important, a tracing will add fractionally to the piece, and the number will bring you back to reality. So you got to have both. I got a picture up here, coming up here. So you're breaking things down into their elements. Compare your experience against the tasks that you need to complete the project. When in unfamiliar territory, spend lots of time researching how it's done for the safest way and the most expedient way and the least wasteful way. And if necessary, make a dozen of them. And each time you make one, the mistake that you made prior, you will not make again. So that you get to a point where you're satisfied with the quality of what you're doing, and then you move on. The tooling and machinery, if you don't have the tooling and or can't buy it, I make it. That's what you got to do. Checkering tools. When I started the clock factory again, for the carvings, they had all kinds of checkered surfaces for the artistic effect. I hunted and I searched. I could not find a checkering tool. So I ground up a bolt about this long, a carriage bolt, squared it off and used a jeweler's file and filed 25 little pyramids in it. And that's my checkering tool. And I use it to this day. But that's what you do. You look at it and go, I'm not going to find that anywhere. So then you got to figure out, yes, you are. It's in here. You just got to get it down here. So the most important piece of your tooling is your confidence in yourself. You've got to say, I can do this, or I'd really like to do this, and then set out on this journey. But as long as you're confident about what you're doing, you'll be able to do it. It could take a while, but you can do it. Reference drawings. This is one of my reference drawings for the movement frame for the zero regulators. You can see I've got every number known to man sideways in this thing. It's because I have to look at it dimensionally, because I'm making something that's dimensional, even though on paper it's just paper. I have to know exactly what goes where, how it fits, why it fits, and where it fits, and what its relationship to the other parts are. So not only do I have all the drawings, but I make up templates for the movement frames. Tracing and numbers. This is a tracing of the entire front of the clock. And I have the stock sizes over here, 1¼ by 7/8, and that one is 1.5 by 1 3/8. And then I have the distance across the front here, and I have the size, the returns over here. And then I have the cutter numbers over here. So when I make one, I miter it up and set it on, and I go, yep, fits in the lines, things are cool. But I know why, because I followed the numbers, I didn't remeasure according to the tracing. So the wood shaper is, in the right hands, is quintessentially the most important versatile machine on the production floor. Like I said earlier, it does everything. It makes arches, circles, straight length moldings, boring holes, serpentine ornamental moldings, wood bezels. It makes everything. We had two of them. We had a single Whitney and a double spindle Yates American. Now the Ithaca Calendar Clock Company had an American A20 double spindle machine that was sold at the auction that Red told me about. Because he and his dad bought the molding machine and the tooling for that. And he said, because he was working at Robinson Carpenter, he must have been 90. I mean, this guy was just a work shirt and bones. He was just like this. So he and his dad bought the molding machine. They bought a couple other items. And he says, you know, that A20 went to the Morse chain factory up on South Hill in Ithaca. It's a big, huge plant. On the top of the factory building is a big square building, and that's their pattern shop. And it went up to the pattern shop. And it was there until 1956 when they closed the pattern shop up and they moved and they sold the shaper to the Robinson Carpenter Company where Kenny was working and where I was taking my wood to get it planed before I started the clock shop. And Ken says, there it is, over there. He pulled up the tarp and sure enough, there it was. And he goes, shh, don't tell anybody. And he says, see this? It says employees only. Nobody's supposed to go here. So he takes me upstairs and he shows me this is the actual machine that was at the clock factory. I have retooled it to accept V-belts because you can see it's designed for flat belts. You see these guys here? Those are big leather flat belts because the whole facility was run with a steam engine. And so I put on two 5-horse, 3-phase industrial motors to it, and with 4 pulleys on it, because the rise and fall of the spindle is 7 inches. It'll go up and down 7 inches. So you've got all kinds of flexibility with it. And then, when he's taking me upstairs, he says, they got all the tools that came with it. And so when Robinson Carpenter went out of business, I was there with $450 and I bought it. And I carted it to the clock shop. And that made everything that you see on this clock, except the hand carving part. It made everything in that clock. That's how versatile it is. The serpentines here, which I'm going to get into next. Serpentines, there's a myriad of shapes and specs to fit somebody's drawing. So what they are, when you make them, all they are is a block of wood and a piece of plywood. Right there, if I pass it around if you want, made the top of that regular. And there's a little block on the side of it that I refer to as idiot proofing. It allows you to set the knives to the right height every time, the same exact thing. It's plywood, that's part of the Warren way. So what I did was I figured out the safest size piece to hold on to while I'm grinding all this wood off, because there's a lot of it. And so I came up with a 4-inch by 16 by 1 1/8 inch piece of walnut that you screw to that. See the holes here? That's what the holes are that are in that piece of plywood. And so you anchor the walnut on it, you draw the arch, take the walnut off, cut it on a bandsaw, then take it to the sander, the spindle sander. until you match it up exactly to that shape, because the following collar will follow whatever the shape is. And if you're out a little bit, you got a bump in it, it's going to show that up in the molding every time. So then I anchored it back down, then I flipped it over, and I set my knives. And this is a 2-spindle machine, and the knives on that board that you saw, they're opposites, which is really cool. And they're idiot proof too, by the way, which is working for me. So the cutters 113 and 311 are the same shape, but the knives are going in opposite directions. And same with the 201 and 102, because you see I've got those numbers on that little board. So that is how I would set the knives, but because they're 2 separate knives, you have to set it up twice. So the first one I set up is the 102 and the 201. This is how it looks on the machine. There's my bearing collar. This is the 102. So this one's going counterclockwise. So when you're driving something down this deep, you take it in several small steps. So you don't get a lot of resistance. You don't get any chipping. You get a nice piece of work, and you're not losing a piece of wood. Or you're not knocking your teeth out, because 5 horsepower gets a hold of something, and it ain't letting go. So you see here, see all those little ridges? Each one of those is 1/8 of an inch. And that's the tip of the bull nose for this 102 here. And it said 6 passes at 1/8 of an inch drop per pass. And now this is the 112, 113 up here. Now this is the same one going in the same direction. You can see how the collar just feels along the line here for the shape. And that's what those guys used, because you'll notice there's no fence or anything with it. It's just free spinning blades, 5 horses apiece, running about 3,800 RPMs. And they're not small. Those blades are about this long, about 2 1/4, almost 3 inches long per piece. So they make a pretty good airfoil sound. It's kind of like an airplane. And the first time you turn it on, you go, but you get used to it, I think. So anyways, that's how they do it. And because they would start over each time, they would block off the template with 2 spindles. How do you synchronize for the height between them? Well, the machine is each rotation of the wheel is exactly 1/8 of an inch. So, and you'll see they're off a little bit because they were off 1 tooth when I set it up. But you turn that literally around once, and that's 1/8 of an inch. So if half of it is a 16th, 1/4 of it is a 32nd, and 1/8 of it is a 64th of an inch, or you can sand that out. There's no problem. So that's how you would sync them up. And you wouldn't really have to think too much about it. So once you get your shape, here I've got another one up here, and another one down here. I traced the outline for the backer board that it's going to be glued to, and cut it out on a bandsaw, and sand the contour on the outside, on the out edge, and then draw on with another template I have, the ends. You see, I used to think that they would make these and cut these out, and they have the backer board, and they cut that out, and then they put the 2 together. And you better pay close attention to the pencil line, or something's not going to work. So I decided that was foolish, and started gluing them up with the extensions on them, and cut them off on my jigsaw. So there's never any variation. So then, where was I going with it? The shaper. I made 10 of these a while ago. What, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, something like that. I made 10 of these, and in order to get the side of that case, the side of the case is about that wide. And it's a real graceful OG, serpentine shape to it. There's some of the soldiers. So what I did was I traced an old one. I was able to get a piece of paper under it and trace that pattern out. And then I said, now how can I do it on my shaper? Because, excuse me, this molding was done on their big molding machine. It's a whole other project all by itself. Those molding machines would run anywhere from 40 to 140 feet a minute in production. But I didn't have that kind of thing. I don't have the space for it. I don't have nothing. So what I decided to do, thank you, was break it down into its elements. So I took the whole size of it and broke it down into 3 pieces. And I made 3 knives that overlap each other to make up the shape. And since I have such a large throw, it's called, on the shaper, I was able to easily navigate that entire width. As you can see, it's 7 inches over there. That's how they would, I run the center first. That way I've got all my stability from here all the way out to the end of the board, and from here all the way out to the end of that board. There's no rock, there's no nothing. It's nice and stable. You just push it right across. It cuts it like butter. And then the same goes for either of the 2 sides, because you'll notice that the bevel on this is on this face, and then the bevel on this is on the other face, because I'm having them both go in the same direction, so that I'm utilizing, putting all my force on the bottom instead of having to try to keep something from rocking out, because it's 7 inches up there. That can wobble back and forth with the knife striking the material. You'll get chatter, and you'll never sand that out. So that's why I did it that way. It worked out pretty well. So then we started making, at the clock shop, we started making office clocks. And so I had to figure out, how am I going to get Fred to make doors and make them all the same, all this stuff? So I designed some fixtures and hold downs to make a door. Now you would think that they would be cut out on a bandsaw and then they would be sanded and that would be the end of the story. You cut the circles out with a scroll saw and you put it on the shaper to inset the dials and so on. So make the whole thing on the shaper. This is from the clock shop. You can still see some of the ICC CO 1980 over here. Well, after I'm done, we can come up and take a look at these because they're too heavy and they're too big to run around, because I still have wood in them, just to give you an idea as to what the thing was all about. But anyways, this is how I designed up the door, just like the library clock, in a series of squares, rectangles and squares, with a spline holding them together, so that, and we had a glue table. We would assemble these rectangles so that they would all have the same space at the same spots. So I could put them all on my hold down, in my fixture, put the top on it, wing nuts on it, and take it to the shaper and just grind it right off. But what we were doing was we would set it into the fixture, draw it out with a pencil, take it to the bandsaw, and just hog them out real fast. You know, about 1/2 an inch, 3/4 of an inch over the line. So you can cut out real fast if you're not having to pay real close attention. So we could get the maximum rate out of it. So then we put them back in this and run them past the shaper. Now you can see here, I have it set up for the next, there on the top and the bottom, I put these blocks because I had the wing nuts to clear on the table, because I designed this so that you would flip it over and over and over, so that the shaper was always going with the grain. I would run this one, then I would run this one, then I would flip it upside down and then run this one and run this one. And it was always with the grain, no chatter, no sanding, no nothing. And since it was done that way, I could put them in another fixture, draw out the circles, cut them out fast on the scroll saw, put them back in the fixture, cut the circles out with the bandsaw, with the shaper, and then cut the insets for the bezels and dials in the glass, all from this one fixture. So it's not done. on a bandsaw. It's done with a shaper. And all of them were all the same. Everything fit, every single one. You could take one door off, all the hinge holes, everything, all the centers, everything matched up all the time. So you could just make a stack of them one day. And you would know that no matter what you made the next day for that, that was all going to match up with everything else. This is the big lathe we had. This is an 8-foot. This is an 8-foot bed pattern maker's lathe from about 1880. That was a piece of machinery. It has right here is a tool rest. The tool rest is on a crank, so you can run it in and out and back and forth. And the tailstock is the same. It's got a crank here to run it off center so that you can turn tapers. So we use this to make the bezels. And this is the pattern makeup for making all the bezels for all the office clocks. They were obviously in 2 sets of squares, and you would offset them centers to centers on the glue joints so that they were really stable and very strong, so that you could beat the heck out of them if you had to, and they would still be okay. So when you assemble this together, it's like a snowflake. We used to call them snowflakes. We would take one corner here and one corner here on a faceplate on that big lathe, put in a turnbuckle, and then run the feeder into it, because we would calculate where the cuts were going to be for the secondary wood here, and then for the outside, for the actual finished piece out there, this piece. You can see how the seams all line up. This bezel I made 5 months ago. The snowflake I made 5 months ago, this bezel is leftovers from the clock shop days in the early 80s, and they still match up. And so this is the way they look on the inside. See these 4 little holes here? We would turn out a faceplate with a disc on it, and screw that into that faceplate so that we could run the outside edge. We would mark them. You can see the scribe marks from on the big lathe. And once we scribed them out, then he would take them off and we would cut them out on a scroll saw again, then chuck them back up and turn them out time after time after time after time. But for some reason, this one got away from him. And that's why I had it. And I'm out walking around the floor and I go, Skip, what's that? And he goes, oh, you don't want to know. And I picked it up and went, oh, cool, I think I'll take it home. So these are a couple of them that I made 5 months ago, 8 months ago. And correction for the calendar mechanisms, they have the little loop on the top. All of the old ones have loops on the top. I said, I'm not doing that. I put it on the bottom, and I put a kink into it so that no matter who you are, you're going to push that up, and you're only going to push it up so far. Otherwise, you'll rack the arms out of the calendar mechanism. You could cause all kinds of problems. So I idiot-proofed it. It works perfect. So now we'll get into a little carving. Am I doing okay? Okay. I'll go back one here. All right, so what I was going to show you next is carving for these. These are the front returns, and these are the returns for this is the top front and the top return for any and all clocks. So I was going to show you how I did that. They have that flat spot on them, so you'll notice 2 things here. Well, 3 things. Number 1, it's an OG molding that I ran on the shaper. Number 2, the pattern is on the back, not on the shape, so that they're always consistent. Nothing is moving, because you would have to make a template, and it would only be paper or maybe cardboard, more likely paper, and the patterns would vary as the edge of the paper would wear. From pushing a pencil on it, it would start fraying, and then if you didn't hold it in there quite right, things would move around a little bit. It would be this way or that way a little. So I used a saw to cut the flat spot on the back, and then I would cut it on my jigsaw from the back to the front. So that's the return, one of them. As you see, before I've drawn anything on it or done any carving work. So here's another point. When you're making this kind of thing, this is mitered, and that's not really very big. So you double them up so that there's a right and a left, and you just miter each end. You draw your pattern on it, and you cut them out. So you can cut it out of a piece of wood like this instead of trying to hold on a little thing, try to cutting on a miter saw. You know, you lose things that way. And so the same thing works with the returns. These are actually quite small. They're maybe 3 1/4 inches across. So I double them up and then draw my pattern and then cut them out. But I was just showing you how the miters will fit together after I cut them out. Like that. So then, thank God for the digital age. Because I took a pair of them from a restoration job, blew them up to actual size, so that I could make reference points for my carving lines. See there? Little lines here and there. That's all referenced from these things. These are not used to draw the pattern on the back. They're used for referencing my depths and the patterns themselves. So once I free-handed them up, it's time to start carving them. But you'll notice again, these guys are pretty small. How are you going to hold on? How are you going to clamp that down? What are you going to do? The Warren way. I glued them to a backer board with a piece of paper. Then I've got all kinds of room to hold the clamps down and then pound all around it and never get anywhere near them. Can move it around so I can get a specific way versus that. And there you have it. They pry right off and you sand off the glue and the paper on the back and you're good to go. So that's what they look like when they're glued up after I've carved them. I got a set of, I was doing 3 of them at once, one time, and I figured, yeah, get a little perspective going here. And that's what it looks like in the white, so shall we say. This is before staining and finishing. So then, the drop. You know, the drop has an OG shape to it, and it's got a leaf carving on it. There, I was making 3 of them, so I took the picture. Now you'll notice that that the patterns all conform to this shape. Now there's a reason for that, and that is that a true OG, one arc is equal to the other depth. They are the exact same shape, reverse of each other. This is the machine that would make those OG moldings. This is the one that Ken Allen and his dad bought at the factory in 1919. And since I don't have one of those, I have enough tooling on the rack to be able to make it up out of all my shapers. And since it has so much throw, the versatility is there to do that. Carving on an uneven surface. Now, there's the OG, and I made this up on my shaper. I did this so you get a better idea of the end of it. So what you do is you have to miter it up first. You cut the front piece as if it's done. And the easiest way to do that, come up with compound miters, is to find that common point, the most important point on the whole piece of work is where it attaches to something else, and that's right there, the flat spot. So that is the commonality. And so there's a degree angle on the back of the molding, so you account for that on your miter saw and you anchor them in place, and then you can just run the miter back and forth to 45 to 45 to 45 and cut and cut, and everything is just going to match up perfect. So when you're making one of these, you take into account, okay, how many, I've got 2 returns and I've got a front and then I've got a carving. How much length is that? So I came to the conclusion that is 48 inches will make one of those drops. So same procedure, I'm cutting the pattern out on the back and then glue it to the front. And I've got all kinds of room. You can see these are extra cuts from when I was mitering the front piece for part of my hold downs. And you just beat on it for a while and it gets into submission, I guess is what you would call it. And there's how they lay. This is an old bank drop, but I put this picture in here just to show you how nice and even that fits in there. You don't have to sand anything. You just rub glue on the back and you can press it down and walk away, and 15 minutes later you can start carving. And it really does a nice job. And then when you go to glue it all together, I made a series of forms to glue the miters together so that it would sit up, because gravity is, when the glue is on the joint and you have these three oblique shapes going together, gravity is going to want to make it spread out and fall apart. So I made these little corrals for them. So when you glue them, you put them in there, they stay there. The glue sets up. There you have it. So now we'll get into movement stuff for a minute or two. To start to do this from scratch, you need foundry patterns and frames and components for my calendar mechanism and shrink rules. A shrink rule is an old school ruler, actually. It's 24 inches long. Here's 3 of them that I have. 24 inches long. The top one says double shrink brass. That means what you make your pattern with that ruler. If you're going to make a pattern out of brass, if you're going to have a finished casting out of brass, iron, brass, aluminum, everything shrinks as it cools in a foundry. So they have calculated out to the thousandths of an inch what those shrink rates are. So the rulers have also taken that into consideration. So when somebody says, I want to make this in iron, and it has to be 11.315 inches long, you make it with the shrink rule. And it's got that figured into it for oversize. And then you take it to the foundry, and then they cast one up, and it's exactly 11.135. So, there we go. This is the one for iron. It says number 30.5, 1/8 inch shrinkage. So the really cool thing is, when you're running numbers out to make something like this, nothing adds up to the 1/8, the 16th, or the quarter, or the 32nd. It's always point something because of the rate of shrinkage. These rulers are made up in 1/8, 10ths, 12ths, and 16ths. So the bottom row is an 1/8, the top row is a 16th. You flip it over, and on the other side, it's in 10ths and 12ths, so that you can figure all those little numbers out and then make it according to the ruler you need. It accounts for it every time. So this one was for our large calendars. So I had to make it out of wood to aluminum to brass. So I had to figure out what's the double shrinkage. So I was going to make it my final pattern in aluminum, because they use a hydraulic hammer in the foundry to pound the clay, they call it clay sand, into the mold. So if I gave them this, it would be broken apart within 2 or 3 molds, it would be gone. So I made it out of aluminum, and I accounted for it because aluminum shrinks 9/32, and iron shrinks 1/8. So you put the 2 of them together, and you make it accordingly. So that's how I did this. So then I took this to an aluminum foundry. They poured me 2 because they could press them in, because they knew what I was going to be doing with them. They pressed them in and ran me the 2 of them, gave them to me. So then I had to sand them all down. I had to polish them, finish them, and anchor them mount them on a board. The foundry just calls them boards. And these are called gates. This is where the iron flows into the mold after the sand is put in. And this is the bottom. There's the feet, and this is called a riser. You see all the black marks there? Those are circles, because when the When the flask is filled with sand and it's all pounded down, they take a brass tube, push it down in the hole, and pull it back out because the sand will stick into the brass tube. Now they have an opening to pour the iron in. And then they have, that's called a pour and a pop-off. And a pop-off is to release the air from when you're pouring the iron in, because the air's got to go somewhere. So there are vents for the hot airs to escape to be able to fill the mold. So the thing of it is, the fun part of it is, you have to make these on a board, like you see, but when you're done, when it's poured, there's no board. It's gone. And this is what you end up. See, there's the gates, the riser, the pour, and the pop-offs. Now I was at the foundry and I went, what are you doing with that? He said, oh, we're going to grind them up and give them to you. I said, nope. I'm taking one just like this, just for myself. Okay. So I made several different things like that for the gong bases and different things that I needed for production. And there again, you see the pour. They mark the pour and the pop-off. And this is called a pressure mold because it has angles in it, and they have to set it up a certain way so that the iron actually flows uphill. There's my little piece. And the board's gone. Calendar movements, components, and the drill jig. Now that I've gotten my frames, I have to make jigs. So I figured the ultimate thing you had to have is a good machine lathe, 5C column machine lathe, a punch press, an arbor press, and a gear cutting machine. Because that's what you need to be able to make these parts. So I found a little 5-ton punch press, bought it off a guy's pickup truck for 20 bucks. And the arbor press came out of the Moore's chain plant. And my closing machine lathe, that's a workhorse. It's got a quick set on it. So you just pull this knob and the tool comes off, you can put another one on, tighten it down and go. Back and forth, back and forth. And because I lived in Ithaca and I knew these old guys, the workman's tools. Now this guy here, his name is Bill Hallett. He started working at the Ithaca Counter Clock Company in 1874. And he was there till it closed. He was a machinist. He worked in the counter department, making parts and pieces. I've got his tools. That he bought when they closed. So this is what you would have to deal with if you were going to be making this. I put these in here just so that you can get a flavor for what this stuff is. As you can see, I still use them. Because some of these guys will wear out, they'll get rounded a little bit, and they'll be leaving burrs, and the metal brass will stretch and stuff. So, every now and then you got to drill new ones and whatever, but that's how you do it. And this guy down here is Mr. Dean, Harry Dean. He worked in the movement room, like I mentioned earlier. And that's Bill Hallett right there next to him. And I have his toolbox too. That was given to me by a guy named Bill Lauer down on the west end of Ithaca. And I'm in the clock shop working away, and he comes in and he drops this thing on my bench. He goes, "You might like to have this." I said, "What is it?" He said, "It's Harry's tool chest." I went, "Yeah, thanks. What do I owe you?" He says, "I'm sure you'll know what to do with it." They turn around and walk away. So I started looking through it, and this tool here is one he used for the grandfather movements, for all of the Gilbert movements that they put in their cottage clocks, and I think there's one over here on the table. And this thing is a verge adjuster for the Welch movements. so that you could adjust the verge while you can adjust the height of the pallets into the teeth while the clock's all together. It arches and goes behind the verge, and you can push the post up and down by just a little bit of motion. It's really cool. And he's got this little dental pick over here that he used to use to change the wire, to correct the leap years in the calendar mechanisms. That's my gear cutter. I bought it at the drawbridge, one of the tailgates at the drawbridge. I don't know, what, 12 years ago, 15 years ago? And I'm idiot-proofing it. I got to do it. And rather than count 4 marks and then put my locator pin in, I mark them all off ahead of time. So I'm looking at the bigger picture. That way I don't have any missed teeth. So ultimately, when you get through with all this nonsense, you've got enough parts to make a calendar with. And so I figured, how are you going to drill it? How are you drilling these calendar mechanisms out so that everyone's the same and you're not rocking, you're not wobbling, you're not missing a hole, because the tolerances on this seemingly are okay, but there's one pair of tolerances that have to be dead on, or it's never going to work. You can hand drill everything else, but the 2 tolerances for the leap year gear, between the pivot point for the leap cam, the month cam, and that leap year wheel, has to be dead on at a ½ inch. So I made up a little box that I could put on my drill press, tighten my frame in it. Now there's another constant point there too, and that is that the underside of the frame is flat, but it has feet on it. And the reason there are feet on it is so that you can level them up, because sometimes they'll rock a little in the when they are cooling down. And so that you would sand the bottom off to level them up so they wouldn't rock, and then drill them. But my constant point is the underside. You'll see, because the feet are, see there, I have grooves down in there so that the feet would be hanging off the edge. And I tightened the underside into the box. So then I could take my drill press and I could drill a hole here, flip it over, drill this one here, then drill this one here, and then flip it over, and then drill this one, this one, this one, and then flip it up on end and drill this one, and go all the way through to here, and then all the way through to here. That's my ½ inch that I have to have right there. So they're all the same every time. Now, there's one thing that those guys didn't do that I did, because they weren't putting the movements in the cases. They were just making the calendar mechanisms and shipping them off to the movement department. Every single calendar in any one of these Ithaca clocks is proprietary to that clock, because the guy who was drilling the holes just drilled the holes in the main frame to anchor it into the case. Well, I made a template. I made the bottom of the box with the same 4 holes for every one of those damn things, so that I could make a template and lay it on my piece that's going into the movement frame ahead of time. Find my center, mark it, lay that frame down, mark the holes, drill the holes, and then assemble the movement frame. And every one of my calendars fits in the exact same spot, and I don't have to think about it. And there's the finished product of all. So then I'll do something real quick, and then it's time to go. I think I'm kind of taking too long. So the only difference that I found between wood and metal is the density. Other than that, some of it's tooling, but that's a tooling thing. That's a cutting thing. They're all the same. It's all the same stuff. So this is what I had for my gear cutting. My lovely wife got me this wonderful thing about 3 years ago for my birthday. And it has been a godsend. I had been making fly cutters till the cows came home. Otherwise, and they were working, but man, they just beat and beat and beat and beat. So when I'm making my movements, time movements, I don't cross out the wheels, because it takes me longer to cross out the wheels than you're going to get out of money sending it back to recycle it. So that's history. But this is the process from just drilling a hole, rough cutting it out on a bandsaw, turning it on the lathe, and then cutting the teeth. And this is the fixture that I came up with for making lantern pinions. Now, in the movements that I make, I need anywhere from 7-pin, 8-pin, 10-pin, and 15-pin. I think I got a 12 in there too. But this one is set up for 8 pins. And it's really rather simple. I cut out my notches, and this goes all the way through my block. Let's see if I can get it. There we go. And I made it to set on my tool rest on the lathe. And the lathe is a wonderful thing because you can cut threads all day long. And so I picked the smallest thread possible, and I set it to that, and there's a stop on it. You can press a button, and it will follow slowly, slowly, so that it'll drive a drill bit into the end of that. There's my 7, I have the 8 on it, 10, 12, and 15. And for some of them, like the minute wheel is made separately because it has to have a friction fit on the back for the gear so that you can turn the hands. So that I made up another little fixture that's accepted into the same thing so that I could make my double for that pinion. So nowadays, they make these carbide bits that fit it. They're ridiculously sharp, and they are brittle beyond brittle. So you have to really watch your feet. But I can drive them in. So my machine goes, ridiculously slow, so I'm not stressing out the drill bit. And when it stops, and then I back it off. I hit my index, turn to the next notch, back and forth, and they come out really great. And another thing that I do that the old guys didn't do is I cap them instead of knurl them because it just seemed to be easier for me. And so that's what they all look like when I'm in my movements. And then I figured, well, I got to have the spring washers for great wheels and for the minute wheels. So I came up with this little fixture to make those. And that's actually how they go. Then I would cut them out on a stamp and then just bend the ends and make them. These are great wheels and the different components for them. Front and back plates. I'm doing this got to get a little quick here. Everybody familiar with click spring? This is the same thing that he does for locating his wheels on his plates, only I don't have a breech port. So I made my main body out of oak. Why not? Put a thread in it, and otherwise it's the same procedure. And I made a whole lot of different little tchotchkes to go in the holes for different applications. So then I would line up and find my holes. And according to the dial, you have the center shaft is in the center of the dial, and the winders are at X and X. So once you've established those, then I could use the depth finder, and you can see I've scratched my circles where they intersect. See, I got my two circles, because that's a straight line there. And then there's 2 circles. And I made these big enough so that I had a little countersink. I would just touch them. And then I would put another plate in and touch them. And it would account for both plates at the same time. The B there is for the back plate because there's back gearing on it that the front plate doesn't have. So this is what I make for my regulator clocks. There's the back with the different arrangement on it. With my lantern pins, I'm just giving some quick shots of different side views. And the verges, I have to grind those out by hand. Then you put them, what those guys did, what I'm doing, is you put them in the clocks, before the clocks are finished. Get all your alignments up, and I set them up overnight and I let them run. Then I take them out, color them according to the owner's wishes, put them on the wall, time them out, and when they're done timed, they're ready to go, and that's it. That's the end. Anybody have any questions or any other things? Yeah?
How did you move the big machines that you bought? How did you get that big shaper up into your shop?
Oh, well, not easily. I had to break it, took it every bolt out. The top of the table is 54 by 38, and it's one piece of iron. And I'm telling you what, I dragged it across the floor, set it up. I had the rest of it all put together because I knew I was going to need the ballast and I had it pushed against the wall. And I leaned it up on it, and I got underneath it and started to pick it up and going, I don't think I can do this. But I kept going, kept going, kept going. And I got it to the tip point, and I knew I was home free. So now I got it up on there. Then I had to crawl around underneath and find the holes. You know, because you got the bolts that are all in the casting, and then you got to find them in the top. Well, that's not so easy to do, especially when the damn thing weighs probably 500 pounds. But I had all day. Then it damn near took me all day. Yes, sir.
How many people work in your shop?
Me.
Just you?
Yeah.
You make all of the parts? Didn't you
Yeah.
have other people working? No?
It's small. Excuse me. It's 16 by 19 is the front room, and the back room is 10 by 24. That's where I have all my machining stuff. Got to try to keep the dust away somehow. Doesn't work, but you know, philosophically it does. Yeah.
At number 0, what's the total number of hours that you have from start to finish?
I've never really written it out, and I'll tell you why.
You don't want to know.
I don't want to know. But you know, when you do this, but you do know that when you make something, you make 10 or 15 or depending on how big the spool is for the cutting that gear. And so it's called an overrun. I'll have like another 15 feet of this molding because, you know what, I'm not going to set it up twice. I'm going to run it now and then pull it off if I need it later. So between scarfing up all of those things, cutting them up, and making the new stuff, it's really difficult to tell. Yes?
Do you still do the, like, when you're, like, putting your dimensions and design on paper, do you still draw that on paper, or do you use, like, pad?
Wait a minute, I'm sorry.
Are you still?
Too many loud
paper, or do you do a CAD program now for any of your?
Oh, no, just a pencil, eraser, ruler, time. But I'll tell you what, when you do it when you draw it out, you're making mental notes at the same time. You're actually doing the project on paper. So when it comes time to do that, you actually are one step ahead. And it does make it easy because you've already thought through, how am I going to do this? Or how the hell did they do that? Or something's hidden completely, hidden joints and stuff. I got to figure all that stuff out, and that's fine.
Joe, how many zeros have you made?
40.
I have a suggestion for you. Have Gail take your picture in one of the windows of your shop.
Yeah, that's probably me. Any other questions? Any at all?
Thank you.
Thank you.